Hello, this is Larry Johnson, and this is the fourth in this series on improving your corporate culture by building the tendency for employees to be accountable. We're looking for people who will step up, do the job, and be accountable for when it goes wrong or right. And in our last session, we talked about professional practices and some of the practices that are really important that you're clear that you expect your employees to engage in. And those included so far were work habits, interpersonal effectiveness, ethical behaviors, and positive approaches. And we talked about it under positive approaches. We talked about the PAL model, that when things are not as you want them to be, and this applies to all your employees as well as yourself, you only have three healthy options in life to avoid what I call the poor me syndrome. You can be proactive in fixing the problem. You can accept it and figure out what you're going to do to live with it, or you can leave. Those are your only three healthy options you have in life. And I think it's important for employees to understand that this is an expectation you have. And one way to do that is to talk about it and to have maybe a training session on where you discuss how people can be proactive in some areas, and other areas there's not much you can do about it. For example, they may be able to be proactive in adjusting their working hours, but there's really not much they can do about the location of the facility where they work. And so you have to learn what you can change and what you can't, and what you're willing to quit over if things don't change. So that was last week's discussion. And this week I wanted to talk some more about professional practices that you want to be sure that you are clear that you expect from your employees. So let's add willingness to grow. Do you expect your employees to grow out of their job and to become something more, or at least more effective within the job, to get training, to accept assignments that are challenging, to be willing to try new things? And if that's an expectation, I think it should be if you want a really healthy corporate culture, then being clear that you expect that is important. I worked with a CEO of a company that's a chemical coating company that basically puts the coating on aluminum cans. If you've drunk a Coors beer sometime in your life, you probably had it out of a can. It would probably came from one of his coated cans. Anyway, he had a really interesting approach. When he would hire new employees, he would explain to them that he didn't want them in the same job more than 2 years. That after 2 years, they needed to either change the job to be more expansive, or find a better job or a different job within the organization, or even to find a different job outside the organization, and he would help him with that. Now, you may say, well, what? He's encouraging turnover? Well, and I asked him the same thing, and he said, well, it's it's a trade-off. He says, when you really encourage people to grow, they do fabulous things, and the price is that sometimes they have to let people go elsewhere in order to fulfill their dreams or their requirements. And he thought it was a pretty nifty thing to do because it worked, and he had a really fabulous staff, and he was very profitable. Now, I'm not suggesting you go to that extreme, but are you willing to encourage people to grow and learn within the organization? Also, something else I think is important to be clear about in your expectations is that you expect them to take initiative. That when there's a problem to be solved, you expect them to do something about it. Just don't sit there and not act. That means thinking outside the box. And so it may be that there's that assignment that's been sitting there that nobody's taking, or it may be that they see a problem that nobody had seen. So rather than just let us sit and say it's not my job, you expect them to at least bring it to somebody's attention. It may be something totally out of their job, and it wouldn't be appropriate for them to do it, but if they see a problem, to at least bring it to somebody's attention, to take initiative. Also, a willingness to take responsibility. You know, when things go wrong, there is a real temptation to point fingers. And and maybe it's human nature. I don't know. My I'm reminded of my wife. She was raised in a large family, and so and they didn't have a whole lot of money, and so they, in that family you had to protect your stuff, and and so I could hear them because they lived across the street. I grew up across the street from my wife, and I could hear the sisters over there yelling at each other. Mother, she took my pantyhose, stuff like that, you know. And well, we got married and we moved into a little apartment, and one day she's getting ready for work. We both are, and we're sort of rushed and hurried. And she looked at me and she said, "Larry, did you take my pantyhose?" I looked at her, and then I looked at the dog, and the dog looked at me, and we just shrugged our shoulders and said, "Don't think so." Got no use for pantyhose. And and then she just cracked up laughing, you know, because she realized what she'd done. Is there's this kind of instant uh, tendency for all of us to sort of point the finger when we can when something goes wrong. And I think it's real important that we're real clear with our employees that that's not okay in the workplace to be pointing fingers at other people when things go wrong, but to take initiative to fix the problems there are. Also, something to think about are in terms of professional practices is return on investment. Have you been clear with your employees that you expect a certain return on investment, that you expect that what they produce is worth the investment that you're placing in them? And that, and I think that's okay to iterate and point out. We expect a return on the value that you give us. And you may say, well, I work in the public sector. We don't have to worry about a return on investment. Yes, you do, because I'm a taxpayer and you are investing my money in your employees. And I want a return on my investment. And so I think it's okay to chat about that when you're covering the expectations you have of your employees. So here we are. In the last two sessions, we've talked about expectations around the idea of professional practices, including work habits, interpersonal effectiveness, ethical behavior, positive approaches, willingness to grow, willingness to take initiative, willingness to take responsibility, and a return on investment. And you got to ask yourself, have you been really clear about those expectations? Now, one thing you can do that I would suggest is that you do a little exercise where you list 3 expectations you have of an employee, and you can pick any employee you want, and then list 3 expectations you think that employee has of you. Then ask the employee to do the same thing. What 3 expectations does the employee have of you, and what 3 expectations does he or she think you have of him or her? And have you do that separately. Then sit down and compare your lists. And it can be a real eye opener to see what the employee expects of you and what the employee thinks you expect of him or her, and vice versa. If nothing else, it can be a great starter for great conversations around this issue of expectations. So then that's what you do. You sit down and have this conversation so that you make sure that we're both clear and on the same track. So that kind of does us for today. Next week, we will be talking about some specific things you can do to create a corporate culture or an organizational culture, a team culture of that is positive and productive, and will have big returns for you and your organization. Till then, have a good week. Thanks.